evening, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from, and welcome to the latest virtual event from The Independent. Thank you for joining. We are delighted to have you with us as we delve into the critical question on everyone's minds: who will be the next president of the United States? My name is Holly Baxter. I'm an executive editor at The Independent's office here in New York City. I'm joined by three of our fantastic journalists who are experts in US elections and world politics. We'll be dissecting the campaign trail so far, breaking down the latest polling trends, and offering insights into how the remaining pivotal moments in the race for the White House could unfold. The first guest on our panel is Andrew Feinberg. Andrew is The Independent's White House correspondent. He reports on the executive branch, campaigns, political strategy, and investigations, working out of the Washington, D.C. bureau. Bel Trew is also with us today. The Independent's award-winning chief international correspondent, photographer, and documentary filmmaker. The focus of Bel's work is on shining a light on the very real human cost of war to audiences thousands of miles away. Most recently, she has been crisscrossing the US for her new film ahead of the election, which focuses on abortion access and reproductive rights. Our third panelist is Eric Garcia. Eric is our senior Washington correspondent and DC bureau head at The Independent. He covers the campaigns and the inner workings of Congress, as well as co-authoring the Inside Washington newsletter. And he joins us today from Georgia, where he will be attending a Trump rally this evening. As you know, these events are totally free to attend, but you can donate to The Independent using the link in the chat box. Donating allows us to keep our journalism truly independent, and it helps us to organize more important and insightful virtual events for a global audience like we have here today. Many readers submitted questions ahead of time for this event. I'm pleased to say we've incorporated as many as we can. So let's get started. It's less than a month until polling day, and it's clear this election will be won and lost on very fine margins. Bel, Eric, and Andrew, how do you think key demographic groups such as suburban women, Black and Latino voters, perhaps young voters between 18 and 30, will shape the outcome of this election?
I think all three of those demographics are going to play key roles, either by showing up or not showing up. One of the concerns, if you talk to people associated with the Harris campaign, is whether or not Black men are going to come out to the polls. And if they do, will they be voting for Donald Trump or for Ms. Harris? There is a history of a small number of Black men turning out for Trump. And in 2016, Black turnout was down, which allowed him to claim the presidency. He later told Martin Luther King Jr., the third of all people, the son of Martin Luther King Jr., that Black Americans not voting was as good as voting for him. So that's going to be something that people need to watch when they look at exit polls. Another will be women voting. There is a big gender gap, and women are known to be more reliable voters, and they support Kamala Harris in large numbers.
Eric, I know you're jumping in there. Where do you think these margins will be peeled off?
I mean, I'm going to be, I'm actually in DeKalb. So I'm not actually just outside of Atlanta right now. I'm in a place called DeKalb County, Georgia. It is about 50% Black. There are a lot of chicken joints, barbershops, beauty shops, churches. I'm obviously not too far away from the Ebenezer Baptist Church where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. This is, the big concern for the Harris campaign, I should say, is as Andrew said, is that her big competitor is not Donald Trump for Black voters. It's the couch, and particularly, I think we should add that it's not just that in specific, it's young Black men, and they're the ones who are typically more likely and more prone to be voting Republican. They are a little bit more removed from the civil rights movement than their dads and their grandfathers. And then on top of that, there is also a big concern with Latino voters. One of the most fascinating trends is we've seen in places like Arizona and Nevada and in South Florida that Latino voters, despite Trump talking about Latinos as being drug dealers and rapists and criminals, he's actually improved his margins significantly. And that's one reason why the Harris campaign is sweating Nevada and Arizona. And particularly, there was a poll that came out last week that showed that young men in Arizona and Nevada between the ages of 13 and between the ages of 18 and 34 are now favoring Donald Trump over Kamala Harris.
That's really fascinating. And Bel, I know you've been doing a lot of work, particularly with women voters across the US. What have you found there?
Well, I think when you had that moment where Kamala Harris became the nominee, there was a huge sort of injection of energy into her campaign coming from female voters. I mean, we saw Zoom essentially have record-breaking calls for like Black women and white women for Harris. But talking to people on the ground, I think at the sort of moment that she announced that, there was definitely a lot of energy around her stand on reproductive rights. And that was something that I felt like really got people interested and excited. I think there was a lot of people who were, Eric, they talked about the couch. I mean, there's a lot of people who were really feeling that I'm talking from female voters, they really weren't going to vote. And so I think that brought a lot of energy into their campaign. And I think there is a deep, deep concern about what a Trump JD Vance win would mean for women, particularly as we're looking at the erosion of reproductive rights in terms of abortion bans and potentially stricter bans, potentially a federal ban. And I know that that's a contentious issue because Trump hasn't come out explicitly on either side of that. But there is definitely fear that the sort of future for women could be pretty bleak if there is a Trump win. Again, of course, there's people who are very much in support of Trump, but definitely this movement on the ground that I felt was that with Kamala in the driving seat, that's something that they could really lean into.
This is connected somewhat, but Alex Steeden asks, how have recent state-level decisions on abortion access following the overturn of Roe v. Wade influenced voter sentiment and turnout?
In a state like Virginia, Governor Glenn Youngkin, a Republican who's a governor of a blue state, Virginia, which voted for Joe Biden by 10 points, he ran in their off-year elections last year on a 15-week abortion ban, and it completely backfired. And as a result, Democrats in the state legislature won. Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's backyard, Andy Beshear, who was a Democratic governor, won re-election largely because his opponent opposed, saying that his opponent opposed rape and incest exceptions. He ran an ad with Hadley Duvall, who I'm sure many people saw during the convention, who was raped by her loved one. So it actually had, on the local level, it's actually shown that you can't be too much of a hardliner. A lot of conservatives will say, well, Governor Ron DeSantis did a 12-week abortion ban and he won. Governor Brian Kemp signed a 6-week abortion ban. Brian Kemp here in Georgia, he won re-election. But all of those were incumbents. But you're seeing kind of a backlash and a backfire, and Democrats are actually now outperforming Republicans, even in off-year elections or special elections. So it's really to the point that now Democrats, and Bel, you're probably going to talk about this later, are now trying to put ballot initiatives to kind of juice up Democratic turnout.
And Bel, how does that tally with what you've seen on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I would basically agree with Eric in that regard. I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, specifically abortion, because there is a sense that the bans are too strict, and that the pursuit of even stricter bans or not wanting to include exceptions like for rape, incest, or even for medical fetal anomalies, for example, is causing too many problems, including like the deaths of women or pregnant people. And so it seems it's almost sort of pushing people to lean more towards the Democrats. But how that's going to play out, like in terms of Kamala versus Trump, we'll have to see. But certainly on a state and local level, I saw, and again, I'm not doing massive polls of the entire country, so I'm talking about what I saw on the ground. But certainly that was a major issue that was worrying people.
That's interesting. So moving on to the economy, because I know we see in polls actually that the economy is consistently rated by all demographics as the most important, even though abortion is hugely important to a lot of sections of the population. How have Trump and Harris addressed economic recovery in the post-pandemic era? And are those plans resonating with the public? Let's go to Andrew for that.
Well, this is actually an interesting topic because for the last 4 years, you've dealt with record inflation in the US, and the Trump campaign has sought to blame first Biden and now Harris for it. And for a long time, there was clear evidence that that was working. Voters, when polled, were saying that they trusted Trump on the economy over Biden and over Harris by large margins. But in the past few weeks and months, that margin has tightened and tightened and tightened to a point where Harris is only really a point or two behind, if even, with Trump on who they trust more to handle the economy. And that's because Harris has leaned into this idea that she's putting forth solutions, making things more affordable, because the economy is sort of a big nebulous term. But when you talk about how to make things more affordable and do that in detail, people listen. Trump hasn't done that. He's basically said, we're going to cut taxes and we're going to slap tariffs on things so people bring manufacturing back from overseas. That would actually make things more expensive. And Harris has defined that as a national sales tax, which is essentially what it would be. And voters have heard that message too. So the economy was a Trump strong point for a long time. Now, 3 weeks away from the election, I'm not so sure that it is.
That's interesting. Eric, what would you say to that?
I mean, I've been following jobs numbers these past few years. I mean, Harris has also kind of caught a break that she's kind of almost, to borrow from her, unburdened by what has been, to Andrew's point. She's talking about affordability, and specifically she's talking about things that this goes to the salience about her being the first woman of color to be a Democratic nominee, a major party nominee. She's talked a lot about the care economy. She's talked a lot about making childcare more affordable. She's taught last week she announced a policy to make home care paid for by Medicare instead of Medicaid, because that's something that's typically only happens with the poor. And that's something that typically falls, home care for elderly people and people with disabilities typically falls on women. She didn't announce that on The View on accident. She did that specifically and deliberately. On top of that, one of the biggest issues, if you look at polling, even with young people, the top issue with young people is not Israel-Palestine. It's not climate change. It's not guns. It's inflation and affordability. So she's talked a lot about building more housing and creating more incentives. Whereas what you've seen with Trump is that anything and everything goes back to the border. And look, immigration is a top of mind issue. Depending on where you are, it's sometimes even more salient than abortion. But, when everything is a hammer, when all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So they've just been talking about deporting people to bring down the cost of housing, when really what you need to do is you need to expand the building of housing. And Harris is talking about that. She's talked more about the demand side, but not enough on the supply side. So I think that's the other thing. She's also caught a break in the fact that inflation is going downward. And just last month, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell announced a cut in interest rates. So she's actually starting to gain on the economy, to Andrew's point.
So looking now at foreign policy, how might the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is now extended into Lebanon, influence American voters? Bel, could you start us out on that? I know you've got a lot of experience in the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Eric just made a good point here that I think in terms of the main thing that people are worried about, I assume in America, most people are worried about, how much their day-to-day cost of living is. But if we look at it from a foreign policy lens, I think, traditionally, Arab voters would have leaned maybe more Democrats. But with what's happened since 7th of October last year, with the devastating war on Gaza, the US support for Israel, and now how Israel has opened up a front in Lebanon with over 1 million people displaced, and the death toll in Gaza soaring past 42,000 and swathes of the Strip being destroyed, there is a deep, deep concern for the Biden administration's position and unwavering support for Netanyahu. And I think that has influenced voters in terms of the Arab vote, because we're seeing, or at least we saw before Harris became the presidential nominee, the sort of polls showing that Biden had lost a lot of support from among that demographic. That's improved with Harris, because I think there is an association with Biden's decision-making in the Middle East. but certainly it's still a tie with Trump. And I remember when Trump, was in office, and I was living, between Jerusalem, between Beirut, between these areas, and it was a chaotic presidency for the Middle East. I mean, you would wake up in the morning and there'd be a tweet from Trump insinuating that the US was at war with Iran, and we'd all be scrabbling around trying to work out if that's real or not, or what's going on. There was obviously key moments where he moved the embassy, the US embassy, to Jerusalem, which is de facto declaring the contested city to be Israel's capital, and he also recognized the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, to be part of Israel. These were all, not popular, obviously, among the Arab vote in the US. But this war in Gaza, the devastation, the horrific death toll, and the continued front now in Lebanon, with the scenes that we're seeing on our television screens every day, I think has eroded support for Biden, who has, been seen to be one of the strongest allies of Israel, and of course one of the biggest supplier of weapons to Netanyahu. So I think that will make a difference. Whether, again, in the aggregate that makes a difference in terms of the total numbers at the end of the day, I'm not sure. And I think Eric and Andrew would have something to say about that. But certainly this has been a bit of a disaster for the Biden administration.
Arab American voters are by and large unhappy about the way the Biden administration has handled this war. There are a lot of them in some very important places, particularly Michigan. That's a state that Harris needs to win the presidency. And there was a significant abandon Biden movement, a movement during the primary for people to vote uncommitted, to voice their displeasure. And that anger has not gone away. Now, just within the last few minutes, I can report that the Biden administration, through Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, has advised the Israeli government that if they do not make significant changes and reopen humanitarian corridors into Gaza within the next 30 days, the U.S. Will be considering taking action based on violations of international humanitarian law. And whether this is being timed because of the election or not, I can't say, but it will have an impact, this news. It's a big step. And as Bel was saying, there is a perception that Harris will be better on this issue if she does get into the White House. Right now, she's the vice president. Vice presidents don't really have a lot of real formal power, but Biden is someone whose worldview of the Middle East and of Israel and of this long-running conflict was formed in the 1970s. He's told a story over and over again about how he met Golda Meir, the first and I believe only female prime minister of Israel back in the 1970s. And that was a formative experience for him. He was a newly elected senator, et cetera, et cetera. And he has given the Netanyahu government the benefit of the doubt on many, many occasions when someone who was not as long marinated in that old school view of things would probably do something differently, because they would see Netanyahu a lot more clearly for what he is. And so Harris is not going to come in with decades of baggage when it comes to the Middle East. And so you could see some voters in those decisive states, again, Michigan, deciding that the devil you don't know, Harris, is going to be a lot better than the devil you know, which is Trump. But again, who can say, really?
On top of that, I would add that a lot of the wind has been knocked out up until the recent images that came out of those places being set on fire in Israel and Gaza. There actually been a lot of wind knocked out of the sails of the uncommitted movement. Andrew and I were at the convention. There were supposed to be these mass protests and mass demonstrations. They went out like a lead balloon. There were like only a few arrests. It was, it wasn't like people were getting their skulls cracked in 1968. On top of that, there's some talk about whether Harris will support an arms embargo, whether that would help her or improve her. She would also probably face some backlash from a lot of Jewish American voters and a lot of other moderate American voters who support Israel. So it's not as clear cut. There are no good political decisions on this. and each of them would come at a cost. So at this point, it's really just about which is going to cost her, which decision costs her more, standing steadfast with Israel and alienating Arab American voters in a state like Michigan, or alienating a lot of moderate voters who do overwhelmingly support Israel.
And it's also worth noting that the Trump campaign has made a push to bring Arab American voters on board. I believe one of Trump's children is married to
Yes.
a Lebanese American. I think that's Tiffany Trump, who is. And there was some outreach to the Arab American community in that key state of Michigan. It did not go over well. To borrow Eric's phrase, it went up like a lead balloon. And so there might be a lot of talk that angry Arab American voters are going to abandon the Democrats. You're probably not going to see it.
So we've spoken a lot there about how American voters might be influenced. Bel, how does the Middle East see this election from the outside?
That is a very big question. Let me see how I can try and answer that. I think there's an abnormal amount of attention that's given to US elections just generally. But I think there has been such a horrific train of events that have happened since the bloody attack on southern Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October, since the extraordinary bombardment of Gaza, and now with this essentially region-wide war, which is dragging in Iran-backed militias in Lebanon, like Hezbollah, and also from Iraq and from Yemen. I think there's a feeling that it doesn't really matter who's in office in the US, that the outcome will probably be the same, because Trump has obviously aligned himself very closely with, for example, the evangelical movement, and which are often very pro-Israel, and also the pro-Israel movement. But the Biden administration is at the moment, doing, according to the sort of Arab voter side, doing very little to stop what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. So I think there's a feeling that it almost doesn't matter who's in office right now, because every side has shown that they're not going to do anything to change things on the ground. And by changing things on the ground, I mean humanitarian access to the civilian population in Gaza. I mean, an actual ceasefire that could bring the hostages home, the Israeli hostages home, and could also, stop the bloodshed in Gaza. A ceasefire that could see a Middle East war pull back before it really completely erupts. I mean, we're seeing headlines like Israel firing on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, which is just unthinkable. And a lot of people blame the US for supporting Israel because of the weapon supply that's coming in, because of the political support. And so I think at this point, the Middle East is just looking at the US and just thinking it doesn't matter who's in power. There's clearly a stand that both whether Republican or Democrat would take. It's not going to make a difference to what's happening on the ground. And unfortunately, the future is bleak and bloody.
If we turn back towards the campaigns themselves, we have a reader question here. Richard Beauchamp wants to know how much attention we should be paying to the rallies held by Trump and Harris. And I think best to start off with you, Eric, here, because I know you're about to attend a rally tonight. You've been to a few during this election cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, and Andrew's talked about this, and he can talk about it later. The first few Harris rallies were very much like the early Trump rallies. Trump still, the fascinating thing to me about Trump and his rallies is that at this point, he's kind of throwing everything at the wall, hoping that something sticks. I think that what I've said, and I was talking about this with you and Andrew before we started, is that Trump's main failure was that he failed to define Kamala Harris. And what happened was, it was funny. I was at a rally in Wilmington, North Carolina, a state that he needs to win, 2 years after I'd been to the same rally, almost to the day. And what's funny is that after the debate, because Kamala Harris had mentioned Hannibal Lecter and windmills causing cancer, he didn't mention either of those. He didn't do the weave, his kind of like sidewinding thing. He kept it only to an hour. But I think what you're seeing now is that, he did a rally in Pennsylvania last night that went completely off the rails, where he was just dancing and listening to music. you're starting to see now more and more, there are fewer and fewer people at these rallies. There's less energy. On Trump's behalf too. Weirdly enough, the person who is doing I guess you could say the legwork and is really going anywhere and everywhere is JD Vance. He is going to North Carolina, he's going to Georgia, he's going to Pennsylvania, he's going to Arizona, whereas Trump is he's doing these side quests at Coachella, he's doing one at Madison Square Garden later this month. These aren't gonna help him shore up votes. He should be focusing more on Kamala Harris's performance in Madison than doing a rally in Madison Square Garden. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, the week after she picked Tim Walz, and Andrew, you could probably pick, because you were there at the opening one, the energy was electric. It was Obama levels. And I went to a rally in Arizona, just outside of Phoenix in Glendale. It was like being at a pep rally. There were people doing the wave. Whether she could keep that momentum, I think, is really important. And tonight he'll be doing a town hall with women voters. He needs to fix his problem with women. And then he's going to be in Atlanta. We'll see how he does with black. If there are any, I'll let you know. I'll be talking about if there are any black voters there.
And
Yeah, the early Harris rallies were raucous. They
Yes.
were loud. At one point I had my the sound meter on my watch going, and the numbers kept getting higher and higher and higher as different people came out and riled up the crowd. And when she was introduced, it was very loud at a level I have not seen since the 2016 Trump campaign. The rallies for Tim Walz are the same. I was embedded with the Walz operation a couple weeks back. I went to an event in North Carolina. He's the undercard. He's the vice presidential candidate. That's not an office that has a lot of power. There's the old joke about there were two brothers who grew up. One went off to sea and the other became vice president. Neither was heard from again. Well, people want to hear from Tim Walz, and this North Carolina rally drew a couple thousand people to see a guy who, if they win, is not going to have a lot of power, not going to have a lot of formal responsibility, but they still want to see him because people are excited about this ticket in a way that you did not see with Joe Biden ever. And that's something that can't be quantified. And even if the Trump campaign has picked up a little bit of momentum, you're still not seeing as much momentum and excitement as you are seeing on the Democratic side, even with the traditional Democratic bedwetting. There's something happening that is a big deal and could make a difference, because people like to vote for things, not necessarily against things, and they like Kamala Harris.
And they also
to talk about these rallies without talking about one very shocking thing that happened, obviously, at a Trump rally. Nathan Goldstein wants to know to what extent the attempts of assassination against Trump have influenced the campaign atmosphere.
I mean, if you look at the poll, I mean, what's fascinating is I've been to a few. I went to a Trump rally right after, about 2 months after he was shot. 3 months. There's now a glass in front of him, in front of his podium, just like that. He's just kind of in this cocoon. It kind of reminds me of like the Pope Mobile. There definitely is a feeling when you're talking with people, like, oh, if Trump was in charge, there'd be snipers all over, things like, there really is kind of this feeling. I don't want to say anxiety, but it's something that I was talking with people when I was going to go get some mac and cheese in North Carolina at a rally. Like, there is this perception that this could happen again. And there's this recognition that this could happen again. What's fascinating, and I think one of the reasons why Democrats, to Andrew's point, are wetting the bed, is because Trump's approval rating went to its highest it's ever been after he was shot, and he hasn't come down from it. So even though Harris has taken the lead in some ways, that created this kind of coalescing. I remember I was talking with a Republican member of Congress just days after Trump was shot, and he said, Carlos Jimenez, a Republican from Florida, and he said, we're not going to take it anymore. There was this real feeling of whatever anxieties people had about Trump after that, before then, set him aside. This guy they tried to put a bullet in his head. Let's rally behind this guy. And then there was the event, the one in Florida, the thwarted assassination. There was a third attempt at Coachella Valley. So that kind of just makes people like him even more. One of the most popular shirts you'll see at rallies are of him pumping his fist with blood coming down his cheek, saying "fight." It's a hit. It's made him a folk hero.
That's true. There's you see that photo a lot, and unfortunately, I don't think the people selling those T-shirts are kicking back the royalties to Evan Vucci or the Associated Press, and they absolutely need to be. But the one thing I will say about the assassination attempt is I disagree with Eric. It's not going to matter. It was in July. It did galvanize some support for Trump on the Republican side, but I'm just going to point you to the last time you had assassination attempts on a candidate for president. Gerald Ford, twice when he was running within the span of a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Two different people tried to shoot him. Ford lost to Reagan. To Carter. He lost to Jimmy Carter. It's not something that is going to make a difference when voters go to the polls. Maybe if it were a week out from the election, it might. But this whole they're trying to kill him, so we must be doing something right thing. That's something that you're only seeing among the MAGA faithful. It's not convincing. It's not convincing anyone who is on the sidelines and undecided. That's a talking point for the converted already, because they already think that, in their words, the deep state is trying to take him down in various ways. So that's nothing new. So the assassination attempts, horrible. The Secret Service has stepped up. They're giving him access to things that normally only the sitting president gets. The ballistic glass that Eric talked about is something that you normally only see with sitting presidents. Trump, you saw it when he was president. If you look at tapes of that rally he did on January 6, 2021, there was ballistic glass in front of him because he was the president. So they are taking precautions, but I don't think anyone, including people I've talked to in Trump world, think that the assassination attempt is going to be something that puts them over the top. It's just a way to keep his 30 to 35% engaged and in his corner.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. I meant to say that like it brings the faithful. The Republicans came home after that, but it didn't fix with swing voters. It didn't do a thing with swing voters.
That makes sense. Now, we touched on the running mates a little bit, but how have Tim Walz and JD Vance particularly shifted perceptions, perhaps, or perhaps they haven't, of the presidential candidates?
Well, I think.
I was going to say, do you want me to start it? Oh, sorry, go for it.
Oh no, go ahead.
I'm just going to say very quickly. I mean, I'm just jumping in there because looking at through the lens of what I've been doing, going crisscrossing America, JD Vance's, childless cat lady comments and his clear position on abortion have not done well amongst, a lot of the female voters that I've been speaking to, and in fact have, worried people in terms of potentials for, federal abortion bans, which again is a lot more complicated than whether or not people want to be pregnant or not. It impacts, healthcare. It is integral part of like OBGYN care for pregnant people. So I think that has worried women a lot. And then just to very quickly look at from the other lens that I see the world from the Middle East and from international politics, there were many people that Harris could have chosen to be a running mate, and I think Tim Walz was seen to be a bit of a relief, particularly from people coming from the Middle East, because there were people in the running who had quite strong opinions on what is happening, who perhaps would have been seen to be more pro Netanyahu, for example. And so I think from that lens, the choice of Walz was seen to be a more careful less divisive one, if that makes sense. So just from my two small lenses, I would say those were the sort of initial responses that I saw.
One of the things that's fascinating to me about JD Vance, again, I said this earlier, is that he is, because Trump is doing all these weird side quests, yes, he is incredibly off-putting to a lot of, particularly women, particularly people. He's actually doing worse with men. If you look at some polls, he was doing. He is becoming the workhorse while Trump is just not interested in campaigning a lot. He is carrying the load, but with that means that he's doing a lot more media interviews. This weekend he had an interview with the New York Times where he was at, or Friday, where he was asked if Trump had lost the election. And any time he has these kind of confrontational interviews and he's asked about Trump's record, he almost immediately pivots. He will deny that Trump lost the election. He'll pivot when he's talked about the fact that he used to hate Donald Trump and now he loves Donald Trump. He also gets a lot of questions, as Bel said, about abortion or his comments about childless cat ladies. He's just become it's become something that's become almost a liability. What's interesting is that his debate performance, he's still underwater, but it eroded his negativities, it eroded his favorabilities. And I think that's why a lot of Democrats were really frustrated with Tim Walz, because yes, Walz's numbers went up after the debate, but they felt that Walz missed a chance to weaken JD Vance even more. As far as Tim Walz, I think the thing that a lot of people saw, I was at the convention and I was talking with a lot of people. There were more, if you look at the polling, he's actually more popular than Kamala Harris if you look at some polling. And on top of that, he has managed to get every faction of the Democratic Party just excited. As Bel was saying, a lot of progressives were worried about Josh Shapiro because you've seen his governor of Pennsylvania because he's too hawkish on Israel. Some people were worried about Mark Kelly because they didn't want to lose that seat in Arizona, that senator from Arizona. So Walz has somehow pleased the moderates. He's pleased the progressives. He's pleased a lot of different groups in ways that I don't think people realize. But Andrew's been following around Walz more than I can, so he'll speak to that.
Yeah, Tim Walz is someone who was not being considered for vice president. If you talked to people in the media, he was not on anyone's short list for a very long time. He came in late in the process. He sort of stage managed his own selection by going on TV and calling Republicans weird, especially during the Republican National Convention. And this was right after JD Vance had been selected. And right around that time, I had some reporting that the attack on Vance was going to be his creepy friends and his weird beliefs. And that's exactly what happened. And Tim Walz was able to tap into that because he's a very good communicator. He does have some verbal stumbles and slips in embarrassing ways. I can bring up that Tiananmen Square gaffe that he had made that he did not have a very good answer for during the debate, and some other things. But by and large, he's very good at articulating the Democrats' message in a way that sounds like it's coming from a normal person. He's not the product of an Ivy League university. He's not even the product of a flagship state university, such as my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin in Madison, or Eric's far less impressive University of North Carolina. But he is a graduate of a state university. He has a very working class background through and through, and that has made him a powerful messenger, and it has made him sort of the embodiment of what Democrats are trying to get back, which is white men and non-white men who are not the products of these elite institutions, who are not sort of, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but who are not overly educated. That's been a problem that Democrats have had for years, and Tim Walz has scratched a lot of those itches. And so JD Vance did well in that debate, but his negatives are still very bad. He's not someone who you watch him speak, you come away feeling good. he's a very, I think the word Eric used was off-putting person. He's not comfortable around people, and he's just very aggressive and negative in a way that works coming from Donald Trump. When Trump attacks the press at his rallies, when he lies about the red lights going off on the cameras at the back of the room and rants about the fake news, there's sort of a tongue-in-cheek quality to it, because everyone knows that Donald Trump is very much a creature of the media. He's someone who was both nourished by and who fed the beast that is the American press. J.D. Vance will take questions in front of an emotional support crowd so that he can have them boo reporters. And he does it in a way that energizes parts of the MAGA base, but to normal people, he just comes across as mean and weird.
The best example, Holly knows this. I was at a rally of his in Greensboro, North Carolina. The Trump campaign needs to do really well in the triad in North Carolina. And then at one point he said that globalist elites want you to, I think it was, own nothing, eat bugs, own nothing, and live in a pod and be happy. And so I tweeted it out, and then a friend of mine DM'd me and said, "Oh, this is like a meme on the far right." He was like doing a wink and a nod to far right people after I'd published that. So like, and the person he did it with was this woman named Danica Patrick, who's a former NASCAR driver, but who also apparently believes in lizard people. So like, there's always occasionally to the point about Tim Walz, the weird factor is always just 1 inch away from J.D. Vance, and I think that's one reason why people are always kind of have an ick factor with him.
Yeah, I mean, that was a wild moment. I remember us discussing that when that happened, the eat bugs moment. Very strange, very weird, obviously, as Tim Walz would say. Joan Cosby would like to know how a Trump administration would differ from a Harris administration in terms of relationships with Russia and Ukraine. And Bel, obviously, you have been on the ground in Ukraine. I would love to hear what your sort of worries and hopes are around that.
Well, there's obviously been quite a lot of concern that Trump would. I mean, so I was at a Trump speech in DC a few months ago, and Trump basically said if he was president, then there wouldn't be a war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not entirely sure how he would have prevented it. He didn't go into details. He very quickly started talking about sharks and batteries and boats, and I don't really understand. But anyway, going back to that point, what I think he was trying to say is that he would stop the war. And I think there's a concern that would mean sort of pressurizing Ukraine to have to come to some kind of agreement with Russia. And that is something that Ukrainians are very alarmed about, because if you look at the history, Russia has occupied parts of their land and then stayed put, militarized it, and then come back a few years later. I mean, we saw with the occupation in the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then come back and then started again. So when you speak to Ukrainian, officials, ministers, commanders, people, they are concerned that you give a centimeter of land and you will lose miles in the future, and you're just kicking this problem down the lane. So the concern is the way that Trump speaks, that he would sort of push for them to essentially, give up and sign any kind of peace negotiation. That said, there's also a lot of frustration with the current administration, because there's a feeling that from the Ukrainian side, they've had to fight this battle with their one arm behind their back. When I talk to commanders on the ground, on the front lines, they tell me there is no way that an American commander would allow his troops to go into battle without proper air cover. That's just an insane way to try and hold off a vicious front line. That the Ukrainians are consistently outnumbered in terms of people, in terms of the number of shells being fired at them, sometimes 8 to 1, 10 to 1. And that is largely because they haven't had support from the West, most notably from the US, who've kind of given them a drip feed of weapons, and they've gradually allowed it to happen, but it's too late. There's a feeling that had this transfer of weapons happened at the beginning of the war, they could have taken that moment when Russia was at its weakest, when it was pulling back from around the Bucha and from the north and even from the east, they could have pushed back. So I think from the Ukrainian side, there's a worry any way that there's fatigue and there's a lack of interest in what's happening, particularly as the Middle East has kicked off, and we're seeing horrific scenes from that. So, but I think there's an additional worry that with Trump in office, the emphasis will be on let's just have peace, and that for them would be a major, problem. And I think it's interesting just to add to that. And I'm not going to name names, but there are particularly quite powerful Ukrainians who've looked into essentially hiring people to understand the Republican side and lobby amongst the Republicans so they can make it a bipartisan issue rather than it just being something that Democrats support versus what the Republicans support, to model it almost on the kind of AIPAC system you have in terms of support for Israel. And so I think that's something that Ukraine is looking at. From Russian side, I'm not an expert on Russia, but I would say they would probably see a Trump presidency as something they might work better in their favor, definitely in terms of being able to mold the situation, but again who truly knows.
I mean, if Bel, you've articulated, but I could just talk about, there's also the fact that the balance of Congress is going to be really important for this. One of the reasons why aid to Ukraine was delayed, because for the longest time, Republicans demanded that. A lot of people talk about this border bill, but like Republicans demanded that any aid to Ukraine be tied to restrictions on immigration in the United States of America. Then, of course, they said this bill is amnesty, and then they just passed the Ukraine aid. But Speaker Mike Johnson, who is leader of the House Republicans, he had to go through great lengths. It took Iran firing rockets into Israel in April for him to say, "Uncle, we're passing this bill." And so if Republicans take the House of Representatives, you're not going to be seeing aid to Ukraine, even if there's a President Kamala Harris. It might be different. It looks like by all accounts, Democrats are going to probably win the House and the Senate. The Senate has more pro-Ukraine Republicans. You have Senator Mitch McConnell, who is probably the biggest supporter of Ukraine. If there's another round of Ukraine aid in a Harris administration or even a Trump administration, they should build a statue to Mitch McConnell in Kyiv. There's also people like Tom Tillis, Todd Young, Bill Cassidy, Joni Ernst. So there still are some pro-Ukraine Republicans in the Senate, but in the House, one reason why Marjorie Taylor Greene wanted to torpedo Mike Johnson was because of his support for Ukraine.
I'll just follow up on that, Eric. One thing that you're going to see in the next Congress is Mitch McConnell will no longer be the leader of Senate Republicans, but Mitch McConnell will be returning to not necessarily the rank and file, but a very, very, very powerful perch on the appropriations committee, the committee in the Senate that hands out money. And he has said that he's got 2 years left on his term, and he's going to be dedicating it to fighting this isolationist, Trumpian America First strain in his party, no matter who is in office, because that has been Mitch McConnell's red line over the last few years. It has been abandoning our friends and emboldening our enemies. That's something that he has not been willing to allow. And so even if you do see a Donald Trump presidency, you're going to see him Donald Trump run straight into that extremely hard turtle shell that is Mitch McConnell on the Appropriations Committee. And even even if it's a trifecta with a Republican House, the House is going to get rolled by the Senate because Mitch McConnell is not letting anything get passed without just as much aid to Ukraine as he wants to put in. Now, in terms of foreign policy, yes, a Trump win would not be a good thing for Ukraine, simply because the question of aid to Ukraine has been turned into a partisan football by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump. Having said that, it's not out of the realm of possibility that President Zelensky could turn the tables on Russia by using the tools that Russia has been good at with Donald Trump, which is flattery, flattery, flattery. Zelensky is an entertainer. He's a gifted communicator, and he has history with Trump. Whenever Trump talks about Zelensky, he brings up the fact that Zelensky sort of defended him during his first impeachment. He didn't really, but Trump saw it that way. And so Zelensky does know how to deal with Trump. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that he manages to salvage a Trump presidency basically by kissing the man's butt.
Well, that's some hope for Ukraine, perhaps. This election will be won and lost in the swing states. We are obviously trying to get every question in before we get to the end of our time. So Eric and Andrew, I know this is really your area of big expertise and concentration. If each of you had to pick one of those pivotal states to watch in this final stretch of the election, which one would it be? And could you give me one sentence on why?
North
Eric,
Carolina, North Carolina, North Carolina. Come on and raise up, baby. This is a state, it probably is Kamala Harris' best shot at flipping a state that Donald Trump won twice. You've seen a lot of college-educated whites move down from places like New York and California to the state, to North Carolina. On top of that, you have a large Black population. So that's one of the things that Kamala Harris has going for her. The real thing that Donald Trump has going for him in North Carolina is that about 50% of the population lives in the rural areas. And it is that, whereas there's not like an Atlanta or a Philadelphia or a Phoenix type metropolitan that there is in the other swing states. So that's the thing Trump has going for him. Trump has been campaigning heavily in the triad. J.D. Vance has been campaigning heavily. But Kamala Harris was in Greenville this past weekend. She's going to be campaigning much more. And one of her really good friends, Governor Roy Cooper, is the governor. He was almost the running mate. And then there's also the governor's race in North Carolina, where there's a very controversial guy by the name of Mark Robinson, who is a raging anti-Semite, racist, homophobe, transphobe, despite the fact that he's Black. He called himself a Black Nazi, according to a report from CNN. And that might tip the scale. So I really think that's going to be North Carolina.
all right, Andrew.
Well, Eric stole my thunder there a bit. I think North Carolina is going to be a state to watch, if not the state to watch, because if Harris can flip North Carolina, that really takes away many of Trump's paths back to victory. Because let's say Trump does flip back the two traditionally Republican states that Biden won last time around, Arizona and Georgia. If he does that and nothing else changes, Kamala Harris gets 270 electoral votes exactly, which is the number that you need to win. So by taking away North Carolina, Kamala Harris would foreclose that path back to the White House for Donald Trump. And if she does that, that means that other things are probably going to be happening too in other states. And if she wins North Carolina, it's really unlikely that she drops any of the blue wall states. And a win in North Carolina makes it a lot less likely that Georgia's going to flip back to Republicans also.
Some interesting stuff and clear North Carolina concentration over here. Finally, the polls are neck and neck. Could each of you give one big election prediction to round off this event? Bel, we'll start with you.
I always think that giving a prediction is a dangerous thing to do as a journalist, just to caveat everything that I say, having got it massively wrong in so many different elections and paid for it. So I'm going to give a slightly strange prediction, and that is because of the sort of area that I've been doubling down on, and that is, I thought that when Harris became the sort of the candidate for the Democratic side, that her reproductive rights platform might be the big thing that would actually work in her favor and swing some states. And I certainly saw on the ground massive motivation, and we saw a lot of energy, as I said, particularly coming from women voters. But as time has progressed, I've seen a lot of energy and motivation around parts of that issue being brought onto the ballot. So, for example, amendments to existing state bans to allow exceptions for rape or incest or fetal anomalies or whatever the wording is. And that has crossed the divide, the Democratic-Republican divide. So that could see, Republican voters votes for something that would naturally, you'd assume to be in a Republican, vote against something that you would assume to be in a Republican camp. But I think actually, as time has progressed, it may not be that game changer that we expected, that I saw at the beginning a few months ago. And that in actual fact, although this is a major issue, there's deep concern about the sort of future for women in America. In the end, that might impact specific amendments that are appearing on the ballot in various different states, including Florida, but it won't actually necessarily be that game changer that I think Harris wants it to be. And I would defer to Andrew and Eric to sort of comment on whether they agree with me on that.
I agree wholeheartedly with Bel. Even Democrats in Florida tell me this. Even Democrats in Nevada tell me this. In Arizona, petitioners in Arizona said that some of the most signatures they got for the amendment in Arizona to overturn a Civil War era ban on abortion that got rolled back, and then they had a less draconian ban, but they got a lot of signatures from the most Republican areas. I think so. I absolutely think Bel's correct, and I think it would not be out of the ordinary for the abortion amendment in Florida to clear 60%, the marijuana amendment to clear 65%, and Donald Trump to win Florida by 8. As far as my big prediction, I mean, I'll give you 3 for. I'll say the Republicans take back the Senate 51-49, Democrats take back the House, and I'm going to say this is my big one. I think that Trump wins Arizona and Nevada. I think he probably wins probably 35 to 40% of Latino men. And that's the reason why he particularly will do even better, probably up to 40% with Latino men between 18 and 34.
Andrew, your big prediction?
My big prediction is that we're not going to know who won for a couple of days. It'll be just like 2020. The surge in postal balloting that you saw in 2020 is here to stay. And the way states have handled their election laws, they've not made it any easier to count those ballots. And Donald Trump will use that to claim that he won again, whether he ends up winning or not. I'm not going to lay down any markers on the result. But I do think that if Kamala Harris does end up winning this election, she will have Joe Biden to thank for it, because one of the things that the Biden campaign did back when it was the Biden campaign was invest very, very heavily in field operations, the basic blocking and tackling of winning elections, getting people out to knock on doors and get voters to the polls. And that is something that the Trump campaign has not done. The Republican National Committee had an operation to do just that. But when Trump fired Ronna Romney McDaniel and brought in his daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, they deep-sixed that entire effort and put back what they call election integrity initiatives in its place, basically suing to make it harder to vote. And so those field operations have been outsourced to super PACs. It's never been done before. And from what I'm hearing, it's not going well.
Yeah, and it should be noted that Elon Musk is running a lot of those as well.
Which
and that's
I don't think is helping.
Whole discussion for another day, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this evening. Thank you so much to our panelists for their time and for their insight.